Crispin Hawes, as an Arabist with specific knowledge of the Middle East and North Africa, your interpretation of globalisation in the discussion was more about regionalisation. So can you explain that, please?
Well, I think it's the word globalisation is often understood within the Middle East, as I said in the discussion, in quite a pejorative fashion, as it's essentially a euphemism for the malign influence of outside powers, and has become part of the lexicon of pan-Arab, pan-Islamist organisations, Al-Qaeda, for example. So in the context of the region, it's a word that I try and steer clear of because it is so loaded with regional relevance, or particular regional relevance. I think the interesting thing about the Middle East and North Africa is, much as I often tell people not to assume that what happens in Egypt is going to happen elsewhere, or what they perceive to be the case in Tunisia is necessarily going to be the case in the Gulf, for example, is how interconnected the region remains despite the outward tug of globalization. That the power of particularly the Arabic language overlaid with the common experience of Islam means that those nations within the Arab League do look to each other at a popular level, do look at the experience of their fellows and the people they see as their fellows, even though, as we still do in Europe, we'll argue about the differences between the British and the French and the Germans. Egyptians will argue about the differences between themselves and the Lebanese and the Moroccans and Algerians, but still refer to each other much more readily and see common experiences and common lessons to be learned in terms of that experience. And particularly made the reference to the comparison between our expectation of contagion from events in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya onwards in 2011 with the experience of the expectation in 1952 after the Egyptian Revolution that similar popular-driven or populist-driven or military-driven even revolutions would sweep away the post-colonial government structures, which of course in a number of Middle Eastern countries they did, in Syria and Iraq, but failed to do so in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia, for example. So there's clearly that has not changed, and perhaps the interconnectedness of the Middle East and North Africa predates our view of globalization.
You expressed some surprise to the audience that the Arab uprising had taken quite so long in Egypt.
Yes, I think the difficulty of modelling the propensity of a society to erupt is in part one of access to data. But I don't think anybody could have been in Egypt 10 years ago and looked around and thought, well, this is a country where revenue is equally distributed and there is no sense of inequality and not even a sense of angry perception of inequality. So I think that what struck me over the years in Egypt is how that level of income inequality had not led to a violent expression of dissent. There have been specific expressions of dissent, particularly in the radical end of the Islamist movement. But I think most Egyptians, including most Muslim Brotherhood voters now, would absolutely reject any association with the people that orchestrated the Luxor massacre in '97, for example. So I think there's a lack of urgent anger, perhaps, and I think that is sadly perhaps a demonstration of how extremely effective the Mubarak regime was in co-opting elements of the population, pacifying elements of the population, making often illusory concessions to perpetuate its own existence with, in my view, the result that it lasted many years longer than it probably should have, with, I think, potentially long-term damaging implications for Egypt's ability to adjust to a transition period.
And will that have a knock-on effect for Egypt's neighbours? Will there be a greater risk for them?
In terms of risk, you mean a risk of internal revolution producing a change of government? Yes, I think there clearly is in Syria. I think the Gulf states, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, largely don't have the same income inequality in that their indigenous populations are so small. The income inequality tends to be between the indigenous population and the expatriate population, which is often migrants from other parts of the Middle East or from South Asia that do the often lower skilled work, certainly lower paid work. So that the demographics and the income distribution patterns are different. Clearly, it's an issue that the Saudi Arabian regime is conscious of, and in 2011 itself has instituted a huge new program of fiscal spending on top of what has been an extraordinary amount of fiscal spending in the last 7 or 8 years, specifically to address the discontent that erupted in Saudi cities in March, April and May this year.